All right, so last but not least, I'd like to introduce Kyle Bushick, who is studying material science at the University of Michigan under advisor Emmanuel Q. Pakis. All right. He completed his practicum at Lawrence Livermore National Lab in 2021. Welcome, Kyle.
Thank you. Thanks all for sticking around for the last talk of the day. I'm excited to share with you some of the research I've been doing over my PhD. So I know that this title has a good amount of jargon in it, so I want to start by deconstructing the title. I'll actually start at the end with semiconductors. So I'm lucky to be doing this talk a little bit later in the conference so that you've had some exposure to some of these ideas in other talks. But just so we're all on the same page, so I'm showing here on the left what we call a band structure or band diagram. This is very typical of semiconductors, and so on your y-axis you have energy, the x-axis crystal momentum. You can think of this as just like any other momentum. And there's a few features of semiconductors that we see in this plot that are very important for the content that I'm talking about through the rest of my work. And the first is that we have energy bands. So these curves show basically the electronic states that are allowed in your material. And so you have both occupied valence bands, which I'm showing in blue here, and the unoccupied conduction bands in red. And in semiconductors, we also have what we call a band gap. So this is this gap of unallowed states between the occupied and unoccupied bands. And this can be anywhere between just over 0 to pretty much arbitrarily large values. Typically, we're in a couple EV range. So this band structure that I'm showing here is for silicon, probably one of the most well-known semiconductors. And so these features, as we'll see, are very important to a number of the properties that are important in our work. One other thing that I want to mention that I'm not showing here graphically, but semiconductors are highly dopable. And so we can change the carrier concentration in these materials over wide orders of magnitude, right? 10 to the 13th to 10 to the 21. So at the low end, you have things like solar cells. In the intermediate, you have LEDs and lasers. And then at the high end, things like transparent conducting oxides. That's what the technology that makes your phone screens work. So these are just some things to keep in the back of your mind about what is a semiconductor. The top part of the title is a little bit more jargony, but hopefully we can break it down. So direct and phonon-assisted quantum processes. We'll start with direct processes. When you think about a quantum process, you can think of this as just a transition between an initial and a final electronic state. So just if you remember from your high school chemistry, right, electrons are really where all the magic happens, and that's the case in these condensed matter systems as well. And so you might have an initial electron at this ground state in the valence band. A photon comes in and transfers that energy to excite that electron to a higher energy final state. So this is an optical absorption process. So in the direct process, this is one step, right? There's just a single transition. That's it. You have nice energy and momentum conservation between your initial and final states. That's great. These are a little bit simpler to calculate. On the other hand, we have our phonon-assisted processes. So these are kind of two-step processes and have what we call an intermediate or virtual state. And so here what I'm showing again is the same optical absorption process. You have that energy from your photon that gets you to this intermediate state. But now your band structure is a little bit different, and you don't have any final state to end in. And so you can absorb or emit, so basically interact with a phonon, which we learned on the first day is just a lattice vibration. So these are your electrons now interacting with your lattice, which is always moving around. You can basically get arbitrary momentum from these electron-phonon interactions. And so because of this, your momentum conservation is greatly relaxed, right? You can get arbitrary momentum. So these are what direct and phonon-assisted quantum processes are, right? But let's make this a little bit more concrete. So let's say that we have our device, a silicon solar cell. We can think about the material that makes it up, so we'll focus on the silicon. And now we can zoom in even further, and we can think about both the atomic structure and electronic structure of this material. So we've gone from the device all the way down to the atomic scale. Like I said, the electrons are where the magic happens. And so from calculating these electronic structures using things like density functional theory from first principles techniques, we can then actually calculate these quantum processes. And so these quantum processes, right, all these different electronic transitions are going to give rise to the material properties that govern the behavior of the material then at the macroscopic scale. Right? So by understanding these quantum processes, how the electronic structure of a material behaves, we can understand how that material is going to perform as a device. And so to tie this in with the title, right, our materials, in this case, are semiconductors, and the quantum processes can be both direct and phonon-assisted. Now, this has been an implicit part of the talk so far, but all of this work that I'm talking about is done computationally. The CSGF is I guess that shouldn't be a surprise, but I want to talk specifically in material science about the benefits of computational methods. And so there's a number of different ways that computational science can benefit material science. The first is that we can actually study and discover new materials. And so Michael was talking about this a little bit yesterday, but there can be this huge space of potential materials to discover. Right? You have the whole periodic table to be working with. And there's a very limited subset of that that's actually been studied experimentally. And so we can go through using computation and find potentially new materials, new stable materials, new metastable materials. But experimentalists, sometimes their experiments take a lot longer than our computation. And so it can be very helpful to tell them, hey, this is the material that you should focus on or you should really study, and here's why. And so this gets to the second part of, I guess, the middle column here, is that we can study materials. And we can study them in different configurations, and we can look at the different properties of these materials. And that's where the quantum processes and calculating these quantum processes comes in. And so maybe you're looking at the material just in its base form, but maybe you're also curious about how do those material properties change if we apply strain to that material. This is something that we can also very naturally do in the computational sense. Right? We have basically a virtual laboratory that we can be using to study these materials. The final point that I want to make is that a lot of the material properties are macroscopic, right? You can talk about the absorption coefficient of your silicon. That's great. But the contributions at the atomic level that give rise to that material property are not necessarily something you can obviously study experimentally, but come very naturally from these computational, parameterizations or methods that we're using. And so you can break down a macroscopic quantity into its atomistic contributions. And so this gives us a lot more insight into the mechanisms of that quantum process, and therefore potential control over the engineering of these material properties to improve device efficiency, or again, to tell us, hey, you should look at this material for this specific application. So I would be remiss if I don't mention the computational toolbox that makes all of this work possible. A lot of these codes, actually all of these codes that I'm mentioning here are open source with the exception of this in-house Auger-Meitner code. This is something that I've been working on throughout my PhD and hope to release open source. But I do also want to point out that two of these codes, EPW and Berkeley GW, are both large codes that are sponsored by the DOE. So this is really a great resource for the entire material science community, and hopefully we see that support continuing into the future. So throughout my PhD, I've had the opportunity to look at and study a number of different quantum processes. When I was writing the abstract for this talk, I was going to talk about all three of these. As I started practicing the talk, I realized I'll just talk about one, given the time constraints. And so if you have any questions about these other ones, I'm happy to chat afterwards. But for now, I'm going to actually focus just on my most recent work, which is on Auger-Meitner recombination in silicon. So before we go any further, I do want to take a brief note on naming. So the Auger-Meitner recombination process or effect is you've maybe heard of potentially as the Auger effect or Auger recombination. But there's been a call with a proposal within the community to actually rename this as the Auger-Meitner effect or Auger-Meitner recombination to recognize the contributions of Lisa Meitner, who actually independently discovered the process a year before Pierre Auger, given the often overlooked contributions of female scientists, both historically and to date. We support this proposal, and if you happen to work in an area where you deal with Auger recombination, I encourage you to also do so. So the motivation for this work, we can think about, hopefully I don't need to convince this audience, right, that solar cells are very important, right, if we want to move towards a more sustainable energy generating future. But in case you do need convincing, here's a little bit of data. And so in this top plot, I'm showing that in 2022, the total installed generation capacity in the US, nearly half of that came from solar cells, right, utility scale solar. So this is a huge component of our electric grid, and will be increasingly so. On the bottom, it's a little bit small here, but this is a very well-known plot from NREL if you're in material science or you look at solar energy. So this is, over time, the improved best research efficiencies of solar cells. And so this has been steadily going up, which is great. But one of the drawbacks of this is that maybe we're going to start hitting kind of the fundamental limits of materials. And so that's the case potentially in silicon as well. And so your efficiency of your device is going to be limited by splitting carriers, right? So your photons are going to come in, they split an electron in whole, so they excite that energy or that electron into the conduction band, and you want those carriers to stay separate so they can go through your device and generate electricity. But there's all these different recombination processes that can happen both intrinsically and extrinsically that are going to decrease the maximum efficiency of your device. And so there's kind of the single carrier Shockley-Reed-Hall or defect recombination. There's two carrier radiative recombination, so this is how LEDs work. So if you're interested in making an LED, this is actually a benefit. If you're interested in making a solar cell, it's not something that you want. And then finally, there's the three carrier Auger-Meitner recombination process. And so it's been shown that in silicon solar cells and in solar cells in general, if you have this Auger-Meitner recombination, which is an intrinsic process, it limits the maximum efficiency of your solar cells by about 1% to 2%. 1% to 2% might not sound like much, but when you think about the scale of solar cells deployed globally, right, and an increasingly large point or picture contribution to our global energy generation capacity, 1% to 2% can be a massive amount. And so we're never going to get rid of Auger-Meitner recombination, but if we can find ways to limit it, that's going to be a huge benefit. So a little bit more about what the Auger-Meitner recombination process actually is. So again, here's a band structure. Again, this is silicon. I'm showing it in a little bit of a different way. But in Auger-Meitner recombination, you can have either a 2-electron and 1 hole, or EEH process, or 2 holes and an electron. So you start with these low energy carriers. And in both cases, an electron and hole are going to recombine across your band gap. So they have a very kind of particular energy that's given by the band gap of your material. And they're going to transfer that energy through Coulomb interaction to the third carrier, exciting it to a higher energy state. Now this can happen in a direct way, which I'm showing on the left, where again, energy and momentum are strictly conserved between these two processes. Or, as I'm showing on the right, it can happen in a phonon-assisted way, where you get to an intermediate state where you then absorb or emit a phonon and get that momentum to land in a final state. So it turns out that calculating these processes is non-trivial. They're a little bit difficult, and you can imagine why when you're considering all these different carriers and this fairly complex Coulomb interaction. So to do this, there's actually a lot of method development that I've worked on through my PhD, and I won't go into too many of the details, but suffice this to say that starting from a code that really only worked with direct AMR and phonon-assisted AMR and very specific materials, there's a number of different methodological developments that I had to undertake during my PhD to enable the calculation of AMR in silicon. So it's kind of surprising given the, I'd say, broad scale and scope of silicon that we actually don't have a very good atomistic understanding of AMR in silicon kind of to date. And so this work has allowed us to get some of those insights. So certainly kind of increasing parallelism, rewriting and generalizing the phonon code so that it works with all different types of semiconductors, adding in some physical constraints to increase the speed and efficiency of our calculations. And then, like to the point that I made earlier, right, one of the big benefits of using computation is that we can gain insights into the contributions of these atomistic processes to the macroscopic whole. And so that's what these kind of different verbosity modes have allowed us to do, is break down that total AMR coefficient into the constituent elements that make it up. Using, again, a number of different HPC tools to make these calculations more efficient. But just to give a sense of the scope, so silicon is perhaps one of the simplest materials to do these calculations on. Its unit cell is just 2 atoms and has no big D or F electrons. Despite that, doing these calculations, right, requires terabytes of data. So we're calculating the wave functions, which represent the electronic structure of this material and are the inputs to calculate these quantum processes, and hundreds of millions of evaluations of the matrix elements which describe that transition. So this is a non-trivial problem to solve, but we're able to do so. And so what I'm showing here are some of the results. And so on the top, you have the EEH process. On the bottom, you have the HHE process. And so you can see these dots are experiment, and the blue curves are my calculation results. So for the EEH, we're pretty close. In general, if you're within like an order of magnitude for AMR coefficients, that's considered pretty good agreement. And so we get pretty good agreement with the experiment there. Atrocious agreement in HHE. And this is what had actually been reported in the literature. We didn't understand, or there were hypotheses about kind of why there is this big gap. And actually, if you look at the electronic structure, you can see there's no states that are going to conserve both energy and momentum for the direct process for HHE. But luckily, now we can actually calculate the phonon-assisted process as well. And so we see immediately a really nice recovery of that experimental behavior, both in the HHE process, but it turns out also a very strong contribution in the EEH process. And so when you look at the total, you see very nice agreement kind of throughout. Now I know it's the end of the day, but something I said just now is not quite true. If you caught that, congratulations, you're still paying attention. But at these low carrier concentrations, right, we do have discrepancy. And so this is something that we actually expected. This is a many-body effect called Coulomb enhancement. It's outside the scope of our current calculations, but we can use models from literature to recover that behavior. And so we do indeed see that we're capturing all of the behavior that we're expecting to capture. So this is a really cool result, so that we're actually able to describe the atomistic mechanisms of AMR in silicon for the first time. So with that, I'll go into my summary now. And so I know I only had the chance to talk about one of these quantum processes, but I hope some of the takeaway from kind of my work in computational material science is that we have tons of tools that allow us to study many different materials. And in those materials, we can study plenty of physics. And in that study of physics using computational methods, we can gain informative insights, which will hopefully allow us to help answer problems of societal significance. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge definitely my advisor and entire research group at the University of Michigan. They've made this whole process of grad school not just bearable, but enjoyable. All of our collaborators, MIT, the EPW team. I didn't have any time to talk about my work during my practicum at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, but I'm excited to say that I will be going back there for a postdoc as I finished up my PhD. Last but certainly not least, the entire Krell staff for running the CSGF program. It's a very well-managed fellowship program, and I think all of us here can agree that it's been really an incredible aspect to our grad school experience. And so certainly the funding sources, NSF, DOE, CSGF, I think most of all for me, and then NERSC for providing the computational resources that made this work possible. So with that, I'll go back to the summary. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.